So I'll just we'll quickly get started since there's probably time is limited. My name is Tom Bridle. I am a co-chair of the SID work group on governance, rule of law, and anti-corruption, together with Derek Brinkerhoff from RTI, who's here. I'm also a democracy fellow at USAID, and we'll be working on a retrospective analysis of the agency's legislative strengthening project. So if you're interested in legislative strengthening, we could talk about that later. Any panel on just one topic in development is a challenge. The challenge here, the topic here, is looking at two big trends in development and how they intersect, how they interact with one another. On the one hand, as we know, there's a real emphasis on local systems, local solutions, how that contributes to the sustainability of our development outcomes. On the other hand, there's also a growing recognition around the importance of governance, of strong government institutions, strong systems of accountability. Some even dare to say democracy. That first trend has, I think, been fairly well established. There's a whole series of international accords, Paris, Accra, Busan, around the importance of the local systems and local frameworks, country systems approach. The governance objective, I think, is emerging a little bit more gradually, a little bit more slowly, but you really see it. I was struck today that you saw Raj Shah supporting a governance objective in the Post-2015 MDGs. A lot of talk about governance in the course of all of these panels, and there's a sense that this is no longer just a values-driven agenda from the West, but also something which is a concern from the developing countries as well. So you have these two trends, these two sort of sets of objectives, and there's obviously a lot of ways where these two are complementary to each other, where they support each other, where they really build on each other. There's also some ways where there's tensions, there are challenges in implementation, and perhaps even contradictions, ways that it's difficult to design and run a program which both seeks to strengthen government institutions and support local sustainability. And in particular, there's also a dialogue around the shift from just this being a problem of capacity to being a problem of changing incentives and changing incentives of local elites. And within all of this, there's the challenge that you need to find somebody to pay for it, who are the donor governments, and you need to maintain the political support that is required to keep this happening. My role is just to introduce that topic, which I think I've done, and I will not talk very much more. I won't even really lay out bios, because you have those. David representing USAID perspective, Andrew, the DFID experience, which is extensive and deep in this, Connor talking, I think, about some of the political issues around these things. And I've asked Larry Cooley from MSI to moderate, but not just to act as the classic moderator, but really to also bring to this some of his own extensive experiences, his insights from many years in the governance and development world. And I've also asked him to make this conversation as lively as possible, as interactive with the audience as possible, and even if necessary, to break up the classic 3 presentations and then Q&A into a little bit more of a organic kind of a discussion. But I leave that structure entirely to him. I look forward to the discussion, and I hope that we'll have a good exchange afterwards in the questions and answers. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, everybody, for coming. This is a little bit of a challenge, 3:30 in the afternoon after a long day, to try and make this interactive, but try this. If you don't know the person next to you or behind you, reach around and introduce yourself.
It's a little bit like church. Peace be with you.
Peace be with you, exactly. Okay, well, thanks for doing that. Let me try and lay this issue out for you as candidly as I can, and we're going to try and keep that tone throughout the conversation. The Tom very politely described this as two issues. I want to present a little bit different metaphor. I think this is kind of a scrambled egg at the moment, and we're going to try and unscramble it just a little bit. But I wouldn't pretend, and I don't think any of my fellow panelists would pretend, that we've got a corner on this issue. So we'd like to lay out some angles on this and then open it up for discussion. So unlike the usual format, where the expectation is you would ask a polite question and we would give our best shot at an answer, I think if you want to make a statement, that's perfectly fine. There are a lot of people in the audience with points of view about this, and you've got every right to one. The only thing I will impose on ourselves and on you is I want to try and keep this moving quickly, because I think the more people who have a chance to speak, the better it's going to work. And so I'm going to, on ourselves, I'm going to impose a 7-minute rule, and then thereafter I'm going to try and impose a 1-minute rule. That's whether it's a question, a comment, or a response to a question. So we're going to try and keep this thing moving this way as best we can. I get the first crack at it, and I'd like to do that by trying to give you a sense as to how a couple of issues that I believe all are important got scrambled together into the thing we're trying to at least partially unscramble. And for those of you who've been with this set of issues for a while, you'll know that the discussion about governance is not a new discussion. If you go way back, there was a very active conversation in AID about, and elsewhere, about public administration. AID made really important contributions there. And then a big push on integrated rural development, which had a very heavy and explicit governance dimension. And then much later, there was the democracy governance agenda, which was without qualification and very properly named exactly what it was. Slowly but slowly, the larger development community started to take this on. When the World Bank took it on, they took on the concept of good governance, but it was really a stalking horse for anti-corruption programs initially. And so you got a lot of discussion in aid about the relationship between democracy and governance, and you got a lot of discussion in the multilaterals around the notion of anti-corruption and how that all fit together. Then comes the whole Paris agenda process. And in the Paris agenda, you get, if you follow it from Paris to Accra to Busan, what you get is a progression of more and more country ownership, I mean real country ownership, where the countries took control of the agenda and started to articulate it in their own terms rather than as recipients of the conversation. And the countries for most of that discussion, into quite recently, meant the governments of the countries. So when those people talk about country ownership and about governance, what they mean is, give us the money, we'll do better with it. And so you got a lot of discussion around quantitative targets and issues related to what was then called local systems. Now you'll hear a very important distinction being made around that language as it's emerged. But there was a big push on that, and it meant basically putting money on budget as much as possible, and it meant going through local procurement and financial management systems as much as possible. So a big, big push to localize in that sense of localization. And that brought with it a whole host of governance issues. What happens if the countries you're working in are poorly governed? What happens if, as is the case for USAID, the biggest programs are in the countries that are often least well governed? What do you do with that kind of an imperative in the system? For those of you who participated in what I thought was a really excellent evidence summit that USAID put on this must be almost 2 years ago now, this issue came to the fore alongside a new use of the word local systems, new at least in this conversation, which is the one I think you'll hear David spelling out, where systems meant system the way systems analysis means system, like the healthcare system, or a value chain system, or the criminal justice system, where a bunch of things interact as a system. But it didn't just mean putting things on budget, and it didn't just mean working through financial management systems, and it didn't just mean the government. So what you have now are these, I would say, not even competing paradigms, they're sort of alongside each other paradigms, using words that are distressingly similar, but meaning quite different things by those words. So what we're going to try and do in the conversation is see if we can't untwist that just a little bit. So let me, if I could, just say a couple more things about some challenges that I think have emerged as this thing has gone forward. The first one for me is that there's a lot of talk about governance now. You heard it in the other room, and we've heard it all day long. But at the same time people are talking more about it, they're directly funding it less. And so there's, for me, I wouldn't call it hypocrisy, but there's definitely a disconnect between the conversation about governance and its importance and the direct attention to trying to do something with it. Secondly, I would say, and it's just my opinion, I think there's still a big disconnect between the analysis and the operationalization. Namely, we're getting much better at how to think about these things than we are about how to manage these things. And so to me, there's a long way to go in terms of taking things, whether they be either use of that term local systems, and really translating it into truly operational and practical solutions. Third, there's a real mismatch, I believe, between the flexibility required to do some of these things and the systems the way they're designed. The systems just weren't built to be as responsive and as attuned to local and contextual factors as this would call for them to be. So you find now a lot of strains in the system as people legitimately, these are well-intentioned people dealing with this, as people legitimately look at the constraints of the delivery systems in terms of trying to deliver against some of the objectives that are emerging from both of these currents, that put it on budget, work through local procurement systems, and the systems in the systems analysis kind of conversation. A couple of things I think made it worse. The first was that when the democracy governance conversation heated up in the 80s and 90s, democracy and governance was put together into one phrase. It was always democracy and governance. Then in the wake of Iraq and Afghanistan, when there was a pushback on the democracy side of that, and democracy promotion got, I think, unfairly conflated with the idea of regime change, people got allergic to both. And so it became much more difficult to push through something that was called governance because it got hooked to democracy, and democracy got hooked to regime change. Similarly, in the World Bank, they ran into the problem of democracy, of governance having been a basically code word for anti-corruption programs. So the people who didn't favor that started to have an allergy to quote-unquote governance programs. Second thing that I think is a foundational problem here is that there's, I think, a legitimate backlash against overzealous governments and overzealous donors. So there are people who really honestly fear that strengthening government is strengthening the enemy in this thing, and a lot of the discussion around private sector approaches have a kind of an underside to them, which is to remove some functions of government from control of the private sector, and a more empowered government's not necessarily a better government. The third and final thing I'll say is there's not an obvious lobby or a good measurement system for these governance interventions. So unlike something like saving a kid's life with a direct life-saving intervention, or getting a girl in school where she wasn't before, we haven't done nearly as well on our side in terms of trying to say why and how helping systems in the sense of government systems or governance systems is not only important but measurable and attributable and worth doing. So I would say that we've got a lot of work to do. The good news on this, and this is what I'm going to hand off to David and others on this, is people are really trying hard on this, and you're going to hear from David about some of the things going on at AID now, and then from Andrew about some of the things going on at DFID, and then Connor will bring us back down to earth a little bit in terms of some of the challenges to this within our own Congress, and in terms of trying to get the political backing necessary to move ahead with some of these changes, and then we'll go to you. David.
Thanks, Larry. And yes, quite a candid start to a conversation, so I think a lot to cover. I'm going to try and focus my remarks mostly around the local systems framework that USAID has just released, trying to really explain where that comes from, what it is, and how it relates to some of the other efforts that the agency has been pursuing that you just referenced. So first of all, just giving some background to it, a lot of the drivers are, as you said, the kind of developing aid effectiveness agenda, and particularly I think the expansion from ownership by governments to a more whole of society approach, and it was exactly for those reasons that it's titled local systems. The Paris Declaration language talks about country systems, and at the time we were putting this together, I think we felt like we were going to call it country systems initially, and that space was too taken as being synonymous with government on-budget support. So part of the idea of phrasing it local systems was that was less taken space, and we could define it to mean something more. But it also had some internal drivers. The Mission Directors Conference in 2010 and a lot of the experience of career USAID folks was also pushing for some attention to issues of sustainability that I think are reflected in the final product. So just to start with, the definition of a local system used in the framework is that it's all the interconnected actors who jointly produce a development outcome. And I think that's important because that means the system, it isn't a thing, it doesn't exist. You start by thinking of a development outcome of interest, and then you look at all of the web of connections that a lot of actors have that mean that they together co-produce that outcome, and that's how you define the system of relevance for that particular effort. And so I think that's useful just to put out there that these aren't, you can't go to a country and say, oh, they have 6 systems here. It's a lens, it's a way of looking at the world. And its central concern is really about sustainability. The question that it's trying to kind of bring to bear more light on is, if we're interested not just in achieving results in the short term, but achieving results that are sustained, then we must pay more attention to the folks who co-produce those results and over time will be the stewards who ensure that they are sustained. Because there isn't a possibility, you can get results in the short term perhaps with less attention to that, but in the long run you need that joint ownership in order to achieve any real sustainability.
I promise I won't keep doing this, but I just to kind of provoke you all for the conversation I know is going to follow, think about all the things that would really need to change if you were going to do that. Think about all the things that would really need to change if that really were the focus for development assistance.
And so I won't go through all the details that are in the document. It's up on our website. You can certainly take a copy, and I encourage you to peruse it. It's pretty short. But it lays out a handful of principles that are worth thinking about, and I'm going to cluster them into kind of 4 categories. The first is to really do some analysis of the system before you start to work with it and try and understand what's going on. Who are the players? Really not just asking the question, what needs to be done here, but who needs to be doing what? The second is to embrace some of the concepts of systems thinking by designing for an adaptive effort. So, one of the core tenets of the idea of a system is that it's changing all the time, and it's changing due to things that are within it. It doesn't just stay the same other than when you touch it from the outside. And so the implication of that being that you need to expect that dynamism in the system, and you need to make your plans not just to have been thought about once and then carried out for a while, but planned to adapt and evolve over time. And that is, I think, a challenging thing for us, but there's a lot of interest and energy within USAID and across our development community in figuring out how to do that better. Third is to really change our notion to some extent of what we mean by a result, and I think this goes to the question you just had. What are some of the results in terms of sustainability that we can powerfully claim credit for and say those are things that we're targeting, and what is our evidence of those being something that we are focusing on that relates to the results that we all care about and that we're still pursuing, basically in terms of those results persisting over time. So if a girl getting into school is a result, what would be a characteristic of a situation with the local system where a girl in school is likely to be the situation there for some number of years, and can we start to point to those other things as meaningful results? And then finally is recalibrating risk. And really in looking at that, we were looking through a lot of the work that had been done under USAID Forward with direct partnership with local actors, and I'll touch on that in a second. And there was a real emphasis on financial fiduciary risk in that case, which I think is entirely appropriate, but perhaps not. I think we were overlooking some aspects of programmatic risk that had to do with how that work was being carried out, and other issues, political risk, reputational risk, and needing, even if we arrived at the same place, to better document our holistic understanding of those risks and how they interact, and how choices that we were making about how a project should be carried out were reflective of a balancing of those risks and a balancing of risk against reward. So just briefly, to mention the relationship, because I know it's out there and people want to know, of the local systems framework to local solutions, which is an agency initiative started out under the less tongue-trippingly title of implementation and procurement reform, really focusing on engagement with local partners directly from USAID, and a lot of attention to high-level targets on how much direct funding would be done of partner governments or businesses or civil society organizations. I think the systems framework provides kind of a rationale for thinking through the when and where we would engage directly and how we would hope to benefit from that direct engagement most significantly. Looking at which actors in a system you can engage with in a strategic way where that's really going to allow you to be more nimble, to be more adaptive, to have more influence, other aspects that are why in the first place we were promoting that idea. But it's really not meant to be a framework for that work. It is for all USAID work that has sustainability as a critical dimension or expected outcome. And so while it does relate to the initiative known as Local Solutions, it's not kind of limited to it, and it is not saying that we are preferring to fund partners directly. It's basically suggesting that you use the systems lens to analyze and then figure out what makes sense and put together a cohesive project that does the things that the officer would kind of judge.
Has everybody got that? Because that's one of the learnings we're hoping people take away. These two things got really scrambled together, and one of the things we're hoping is that those of you who run up against this on a daily basis at least leave here with a little bit more clarity on that issue. Is that pretty clear to everyone, the distinction David was just making, that this thing started out being just about putting money through local governments, and now the paper that he's presenting and talking about is basically trying to apply a systems analysis, which might or might not lead you back to putting money through governments, but it does not start from that premise.
Yeah. We would expect in a lot of cases that it would imply more direct engagement by USAID officers and missions than we perhaps have had over the last few years. One of the things we heard at the Experience Summit and have heard from some of the USAID officials and partners who have a lot of experience with it is that we used to do that more, and it's something we shouldn't have gotten away from to the extent that we did. So I wouldn't expect it to kind of undercut that impulse, but to say kind of, this is what comes first, this is what you're focused on, and that's one of the ways you can get there, and you should be looking at that and other tools that you can get to really embrace kind of local ownership and a local system that is in a better place to sustain results.
Just one more minute.
Okay. So then just quickly running through some of the implications, and I won't go into too much depth on this. So we really tried to have this have a light touch, not a heavy-handed thing. It's not meant to be a sudden and transformational shift in how the agency works. It's meant to open up space for some new types of work to start being done and hopefully grow over time as we collectively can learn about that. It's really an emphasis on how we do our work rather than what work we do. So the local systems framework, you could apply that lens to any development outcome of relevance that a given project was oriented towards or mission was trying to achieve. It should support more flexible implementation, and I think we're digesting what that means and how to manifest flexibility within the world of tools that we have, and there have been some steps forward in terms of our procurement office and others in kind of working on specific adaptive tools. We're also trying to scale up the use of ex post evaluations that go in and look at a successful project 3-5 years after it has completed to see which aspects of it persisted and which didn't, and try and therefore bring a little bit more rigor to the question of, in advance, which characteristics would we see that we think are associated with greater sustainability. It implies a lot of joint efforts to learn together with local stakeholders and to really foster relationships between them and to be part of those conversations and discussions. And to look at kind of what characteristics like consensus or legitimacy might be key to sustainability, and I think that's an important link to governance work. And then I think, so I won't go into more details on that. So then, do I have 20 seconds?
Just.
Okay, so just in terms of kind of how it relates to governance, very quickly. It is, as I said, kind of result neutral. It doesn't say you need to be doing this or that type of work. But several of the principles in it and several of the implications should mean more attention to governance across a lot of our work. if you accept that there's always a system and that the reason you see the situation you see somewhere is because of how that local system is currently operating, then you need to explore the political economies more. You need to look at the incentives that are at play there, and you need to kind of take those things into account in what you hope to achieve afterwards. And that should bring some, I hope, realism, but also attention to those aspects of kind of systems that produce development outcomes to a lot of our work. And there's a lot of language in it about attention to accountability, and that a system that sustains over time needs to have feedback loops so that when things are working, even if they're working now and conditions change, that there are feedback loops for it to self-correct. And to me, that's pretty synonymous with a good stewardship and accountability model for it. So I'll leave it at that and can get into more details and questions.
That's the second point I hope everybody got, which is that this local systems, while it's not a governance initiative per se, loops right back to the governance conversation, because it says if you care about kids in school, or you care about health care, why isn't the local system doing what we need it to do? And if you start looking at why the local system isn't doing what we need it to do, there's a better than even chance you're going to come up against a governance problem. So the people who believe in governance see this as another way back into the governance conversation, but framed around the issue of local solutions, local systems, sorry. Andrew. The thing I'm hoping Andrew will do is talk to us both about DFID, but maybe also react a little bit to how it's different in perspective from the USAID point of view.
Thanks, Larry. Well, firstly, I want to cover three things in my 7 minutes. Firstly, I want to talk a little bit about a kind of an overview perspective, both on the sort of governance side and also thinking about some of these local solutions and local systems issues. I then want to focus on three challenges and think about some of the practical measures by which we're trying to address this. Again, in a spirit of candor, recognizing that these are hard nuts that we're trying to crack, essentially. I think the first thing to say is, I think I agree wholeheartedly with what's been said so far in terms of the framing of this conversation around what do we need for sustained development on the ground, and a recognition that this needs to be locally driven, it needs to be locally owned, the fact that we need a strong role for government, but government itself is not alone, and we need to recognize the role that elites play and the need to bring pressure to bear on those elites, and to think about state-society relationships more generally. I think we've seen that within our thinking for a while, and I think the evolution within AID and on our own side is very strong. I want to secondly flag that point that we're evolving, and I want to particularly pick up on this point about local solutions. In other words, the use of government and local systems and channeling of funding through that, because I continue to feel that that's a very important element, and that you build local institutions by working through them, and that by using them, you serve to strengthen them. Sitting here in DC, there's a lot of debate around some of those issues, and certainly they look at DFID and say, well, you guys used to do direct budget support, you don't do as much of that anymore as you do. And that's true, we have reduced the amount of general budget support that we provide directly in country, but we continue to use local systems in a range of different contexts to a very large degree, because we believe that's the best way to strengthen them, and because we believe that the counterfactual, a kind of projectized approach, is simply not sustainable. Let me move on and talk about challenges. I've framed this three particular challenges. I think the first one is around kind of understanding and aligning with local actors. And I totally agree with David's sort of systems thinking in relation to this. But I think it does represent real challenges for us as bureaucracies. You know, how do you work politically and recognize that we as development actors are political actors in the scene? How do you understand formal and informal systems? How do you think about some of those issues of incentives and capacity that were raised? And how do you then take a lot of good analysis and feed that into your operational approaches? I don't think we have all the answers to that, but let me flag three particular things that we're doing that are sort of grappling with this. I think the first thing is kind of at the meta level. I think it's important for us to as a donor organization working in a range of countries and thinking about resource allocation and how we work with different partners, one thing we do need to do is and one thing we currently do is we have a set of partnership principles which are really looking at that state government's commitment to poverty reduction, to human rights, to public financial management and accountability, and domestic accountability as well. And essentially we regularly assess that, and we reassess it, and we're not looking for perfect scores on that, but we're interested as well in directions of travel. And we make decisions about how we engage with that country and how we engage with some of those government systems as well, based on that finding. And I think that's really important to frame your country relationship in terms of an understanding of where you think that country is going and how committed you think it is around key development dimensions. Second area was really sort of getting into this kind of understanding the sort of incentives and drivers for a lot of people. Now, DFID obviously has a long tradition of doing political economy analysis and trying to work and think politically. Much of that analysis in the past has been criticized as being interesting, but operationally kind of irrelevant. I think the recent trends within DFID has been an attempt to do probably two things. Firstly, to try to link a lot of that analysis to some of the other sets of analysis. Often you can have a multiplicity of analytical tools happening in country. Well, we've tried to take a more holistic approach, framed around what we call our country poverty diagnostic, and essentially to think about how do political economy issues linked to constraint to growth and sectors that you may want to invest in and so on. And secondly, we have tried to link that into our country strategy and planning process to really bring some of that operational relevance to some of these political economy questions. The third element I want to mention under this challenge is around kind of new instruments and looking for new instruments. And I want to flag the approach of payment by results. So essentially, that's an approach which tries to take a very different approach, tries to not worry about how the development activity gets done and the detail of who does what, but essentially sets a target with the partner government, and if that partner government is able to deliver it, pays. It's quite a different paradigm of doing development, and we're trying to build the evidence base on that to see where it works, how it works, and what the potential to do it at greater scale actually is. So that's the first challenge. I want to flag the second challenge, which Dr. Shah raised this morning, which is essentially working in fragile states. Increasingly, our programs are focused in those countries. And it sets huge challenges in terms of weak local institutions, often social contracts between citizens and leaders are broken. And I think this is really difficult. So just to flag two things that we've been focusing a lot of attention on. The first is really to trying analytically to better understand some of the processes by which state building happens and some of the processes by which political settlements between governing groups, different governing coalitions, and ordinary citizens actually work out, and trying to think through how that then has implications for what we do on the ground and for how we engage. And the second area that I want to flag is the New Deal for fragile states, and recognizing that this is a framework which we think is important as a new framework for governing the way in which the development actors in a fragile state can actually engage.
I'm going to break my own rule by giving you an extra minute to do this, but I have a feeling that that New Deal is well known to some and not to others. Why don't you take 30 seconds and just say something about that?
Okay, well, thanks. So essentially, the New Deal is something which came out of an international process, something called the International Dialogue on Peace Building and State Building, which brought together primarily Southern actors. There's a grouping called the G7+. Especially strong in that is Liberia and East Timor. And that has set out a framework which governs the relationship between actors. And in many countries, there's essentially an attempt to form a compact with mutual commitments on both sides and mechanisms for consultation and for assessing progress more generally. That's a bit of a quick and dirty summary.
Important, among other things, because it in a sense legitimized this as not being a neo-colonial effort by people to try and intervene productively in those states.
Great, thanks, Larry. And then the very last challenge that I'll touch on really quickly is, I mean, there's a whole set of challenges, I think, around kind of accountability and around the internal sort of incentives within our own organizations, which I'm sure Connor will probably touch on in a bit more detail. So, for example, who's the accountability to? To UK taxpayers or to the local beneficiaries on the ground? And I think how you answer that question has really big implications for the type of development activities that we undertake. And how do you support messier, more intractable, longer-term governance issues when there are often internal incentives within our own organisations which are around demonstrating results and demonstrating value for money, often in quite short time frames? I don't think I have solutions to those issues. I think there's conversations within many of our organisations and champions, and we need to be pushing the case and building the constituency in the way that Larry talked about earlier. But I suppose I wanted to finish on a positive note, and I wanted to flag the post-MDG framework and the discussions. Obviously this morning it was raised the question of would there be a governance goal within the new post-2015 framework. Very pleasing to hear Dr. Shah say he was in favour. And just to flag that from the UK's perspective, we feel that that's a really important, we feel that the framework itself is really important for shaping the direction of work going forward. And we think that a lot of these issues around governance and institutions and the work on the peace building side especially are absolutely central to a sound framework going forward. Thanks.
Again, for those of you who haven't followed that closely, this is a really big deal about the governance objective potentially in the MDGs. And the thing that's currently being proposed is called Ensure Good Governance and Effective Institutions. And there's a series of metrics that are suggested too. None of this is agreed to yet, but this is what's on the table. The metrics are having targets on birth registration, on civil liberties, on public participation, on right to information, and on reduction of corruption. That's a lot. And the fact that it even got as far as being on the proposed list of goals and metrics is a major accomplishment. The dialogue in the other room was about whether it would survive the political process it has to go through now. Connor?
Thanks, Larry, for moderating today, and thank you to Tom and SID-Washington for organizing this discussion. I think it's a very timely one for international development. Before I begin with my remarks, I do want to just echo what everyone said. I think the fact that the high-level panel included this governance goal in its report is really important, and I think if we can get something in there, in the end, that'll do a lot for a lot of the issues we're talking about today. And I think equally important is the fact that it was a demand-driven. It wasn't supply-driven. It wasn't donors who were the biggest champions. Were people like Finance Minister Ngozi from Nigeria. But that's just a little aside. I've been asked to provide a perspective on the challenges USAID faces in the American domestic political context over the use of local systems. I think some will recall that there was significant criticisms of USAID's original implementation and procurement policy that was released as part of USAID Forward. I think as we've heard, USAID has made changes and now has its use of local systems framework. I believe aid is moving in the right direction, but I do believe there are still some concerns. So today I'd like to start off by looking at some of these remaining concerns, and then I want to move into to finish with a broader discussion of what I think this says about U.S. development priorities. First, transparency and accountability. These have been powerful themes in international development and are a significant component of the new Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation. Donor accountability to developing countries is important, but I think equally important is the transparency and accountability of donors to their own government and citizens. I don't believe that enough emphasis either in the earlier IPR policy or in the newer local systems strategy has been placed on ensuring that U.S. foreign assistance is being implemented in a transparent and accountable manner to both the government, the Hill, and our citizens. I don't want to re-scramble the eggs that I think David has sort of unscrambled here, but I do want to point out that the 30% target does still exist. And I think many of the earlier critiques of IPR focused on USAID's contract and procurement process, which USAID has acknowledged is not perfect. And so this sort of leads me to say, does USAID have enough individuals in a contracting and procurement process, or simply in an oversight process, to ensure that new local partners, whether they're government, local NGOs, civil society of some other kind, or for-profit, can they deliver on the results? I mean, ultimately, this is the crux, I believe, of the concern over the use of local systems, USAID's ability to manage and oversee a variety of new partners. The second thing I want to look at is this issue of local systems and country systems. What do we mean by local and country systems? I believe that USAID has gone a long way to defining what they mean by local systems, but it is important to keep in mind that when developing countries discuss local or country systems, they frequently mean government systems. And to them, this means some form of on-budget or budget support. I would argue that there will continue to be pressure from developing countries to use their government systems because this has largely been premised under the idea that by using the system, you're strengthening the system. But what else are we doing? Are we looking for additional policy reforms by governments to ensure risk mitigation? I believe that we should look at a more holistic view of how we're strengthening these systems and institutions and not just focus on this notion of using the systems. This will remain a significant issue, I think, as many donors shift to more on-budget aid, and I think it'll continue to create problems for the broad interpretation that USAID is seeking to use here. The third point I want to look at is country ownership. A central theme of Paris, Accra, Busan has been the importance of country ownership. I believe that all donors should align their in-country programs with the development priorities and strategies of the local government. But do we, the United States, in fact do that? Take a country such as Tanzania. Its most recent development strategy lists the following three priorities: growth and reduction of poverty, improvement of the quality of life and social well-being, and governance and accountability. Where do we, the United States, currently spend our money? Approximately 80% of USAID's budget in Tanzania is directed towards public health programs. The rest is spread out amongst agriculture, which is the next largest, and some small governance programs. So are we in fact designing projects or programs with the Tanzanian government that tackles the constraints to growth that have been identified in a variety of analytical products such as Partnership for Growth? To a certain degree, yes, but I would argue that we need to consider how we are budgeting our money at a country level if we are to truly build capacity, improve governance, and increase the transparency and accountability of developing countries to their people. I think if we do that, USAID will find it far easier to find political support for using local systems. To finish, I want to bring it back to a strategic level and focus on how this all relates to the challenge of good governance. If the objective of country ownership and using country systems is to build capacity, then shouldn't we shift toward a broader focus on good governance? I think Larry gave a very good overview at the beginning of some of the challenges surrounding governance as a development objective, and I don't want to rehash everything here, but I do want to emphasize a few points. The first is around funding and policy. Funding is a significant problem for governance projects, which face far more resource constraints than other pieces of the foreign aid budget. Although the United States is one of the largest donors for governance-related work, this is declining, and a significant part of this current funding is directed toward Afghanistan and Pakistan. As we draw down our forces there, I highly doubt that funding will remain at the same level, and it certainly won't be redirected toward other priority countries. From a policy perspective, I think USAID should be applauded for its recent democracy and governance strategy and the argument that good governance is a cross-sectoral issue. But at the same time, we should also be aware that good governance is far broader than simply ensuring that a health ministry is well run or that we design a health project and acknowledge the need for good governance in the process. Good governance means focusing on government capacity as a whole, rule of law, an independent judiciary, functioning commercial courts, reduced barriers to entry for business, and the government's ability to implement laws, rules, and regulations, to name but a few. All of this, of course, is important, but I don't think that we should substitute the former, local systems, for the latter and the policy of looking at this as a cross-sector issue. Finally, just a little bit on political economy. And I think we need to pay more attention to the political and economic context in which we operate, and I think DFID does a particularly good job of this, but there are some challenges to how we're looking at this, and I think the policy that David outlined for USAID recognizes this, as does the DRG strategy. But I also think that we need to look at this from the perspective of, are we going to be able to work with local systems in these contexts, especially ones where you have a particularly corrupt government that prevents inclusive economic growth from occurring or increased accountability to their own people? Are we going to be able to work with the other pieces of the local systems, such as civil society or NGOs that may not be of benefit to the local government? I think even in countries that we recognize today as broadly free and fair, there is a sense that there is a backsliding occurring in terms of the openness towards civil society. If you look at a country like Tanzania, again, there has been some significant pressure placed on civil society organization and the opposition party. And that's to say nothing of other countries such as Uganda or Rwanda. At the end, good governance, rule of law, effective institutions, all of these, I believe, are at the core of international development. I believe passionately that in order to achieve long-term, sustainable, and inclusive economic growth across the developing world, we need to focus on these issues. Local systems can be part of this discussion, but we should not substitute it for more robust engagement around the issues I mentioned above. Governance is, after all, as Raj Shah remarked earlier today, still the central challenge for development. Thanks very much.
That was great. Thank you all very much. Let's open it up to any questions or comments people might have. I'm not sure if we don't, do we need the microphones for recording? Otherwise, do we? Okay, then why don't you move to the microphone, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Laura Haig. I work at the International City County Management Association. My bias is cities. Great to see the focus on local systems. I kind of want to give you a scenario type question and how, with this new focus, how you would do things differently. So last month I was in Jordan and met with the mayor of Azraq. And as you know, there's a new refugee camp about 5 kilometers outside of town. The mayor told us that 18 different donors, agency funders, NGOs have come to meet with him, but nobody came back. There has been no work with them. They still have a lot of dirt roads. They have 2-lane roads that are filled with 18-wheelers because it's right near the Iraqi border. But no one's working with the local government, and they're going to be severely impacted. This is a town of 15,000 people. Lawrence of Arabia came through there. Historic, there's an oasis.
He didn't
and now
stay either, right?
Huh?
He didn't stay either.
Yeah, no, they all left. They never came back. And they're going to be welcoming 50,000 refugees, which is going to severely impact the city to deliver public services. It's going to impact the citizens. And they weren't involved. There was no systems thinking. I know there's been a little bit more about the local systems thinking with the EU and DFID and World Bank have been supporting host communities as an example in the north of Jordan, right next to refugee camps. But if you had this scenario and you were working with the mayor of Azraq, or you were about ready to open this up, how would this local systems thinking, how would it be different? Would it be better or more the same?
I'm going to, in general, take 2 or 3, but I think this time I'll let you respond to that one.
Okay. And I'm by no means a Jordan or Middle East expert, so I can't speak with any real authority, but what I would like to imagine the implications of the framework would be, really I think would be 2 aspects. One is there's an emphasis on gathering different perspectives to understand a development challenge. So not coming in and saying, you know, okay, well, refugees, we know what that looks like, but really taking experiences from elsewhere and actually asking some of the local folks about what type of problem this is going to be for you. Obviously, in a fast-moving humanitarian response, you might be less able to do that than you might wish. But I would like to imagine, in my imagined Jordan, that would be something that we would build in. But then I think second, and perhaps more importantly, really gets to this question of they met with us, but they didn't come back. One of the big emphasis in terms of local ownership and stakeholder involvement is to leverage the convening authority that USAID might have, and to really look for opportunities to facilitate discussions and dialogue as part of our work, and to build that in not as something that kind of informs just the planning of what gets done and then you do it, but actually a regular and continuing part of it. And there have been some examples. There's a whole set of missions that have adopted this collaborating, learning, and adapting model under their strategy, really trying to put in place some mechanisms to facilitate that type of gathering and discussion and getting multiple perspectives around defining the boundaries of a problem and understanding what it is and what's going on with it. So I like to think that people might look at this framework, take some of those ideas, and do a lot of the same work, but build some of those aspects into how they do it. Obviously, there would be some trade-offs, and I'm sure that people were judging that on the ground to the best of their ability.
Russ?
I was happy I could get up. My name's Russ Webster. First of all, I just want to say how thankful I am to have this panel talking about governance, and I'm so happy to see, I'm sure I'm not alone, that it's becoming more and more an important topic. But sometimes I need to ask myself, a lot of the discussion we've had lately, I think, is about how you integrate governance into different levels of your operation. I think you could even make the argument that governance is an important principle for managing a project. And, but I wonder, I think this might be a good opportunity for the panel to comment on the bigger question of, are there things that the U.S. government could be doing at a higher scale, at a higher level, to push this agenda? If you were able to advise high levels of government about really promoting good governance, because governance in its most rudimentary form is the concept of how you interrelate institutions with individuals, and the governance systems are influenced by the people who manage those institutions. But if you were given the opportunity to say this is an area where we could be doing more to push this agenda more firmly ahead, what would that be? If you could comment on that,
I think
I'd
I'll
really
give everybody a
appreciate it.
crack at that if they'd like it. Connor, you want to express an opinion?
Yeah, sure. I mean, first and foremost, I think that we're already seeing that around the governance goal for the post-2015 MDG. I mean, I think the Millennium Development Goals ended up becoming somewhat of an organizing principle for foreign aid over the last decade or so, and I think we'll probably still have the same influence. So I mean, I really do believe that governance and rule of law, we have to have that in this round. And I know that there's a whole host of problems associated with it's difficult to measure what would the sub-indicators be. But just the fact that we're looking at this, I think, sends a very powerful message. And it's, as people have said, it's great that the administrator echoed the views of which I know the British government has been very strong on this. But again, as I said in what I had said during my remarks, I do think that we need to think about governance and rule of law and those issues as separate issues to a certain extent, still think of them as separate issues. Yes, we need to think of these that they cut across sectors, but we still need to look at them simply as good governance and rule of law by themselves help to enable economic growth, help to enable development. So I would very much advise that we not lose sight of that fact within the U.S. government.
Thanks. Andrew?
Yeah, just quickly. Well, two things. Firstly, I think Connor talked about some backsliding in terms of, I mean, we've seen some backward progress in Africa, especially on the sort of LGBT rights issues. And I think for us as countries, we do need to think really hard about how we respond to that. I think where I feel troubled on this question is I don't think we've got a hugely good story to tell. If we're focusing on kind of democratic governance, I think the West doesn't look brilliant at the moment. So I think we have to be really careful about how we frame that. I think we have to think about approaches that actually recognize we need to get our own houses in order to some degree. And we also need to look at channels where we can promote experience sharing, South-South, and other ways of sharing these things as well.
Yeah, I would basically agree with Connor. I think it's, you know, the two aspects I think would be really important. One, echoing Russ's question, would be to really see the understanding of these core principles articulated more across different engagements. And there's a lot of discussion about, within USAID, about our colleagues in you know, the cross-executive branch efforts like Feed the Future, PEPFAR, and making sure that some of these principles are part of how they approach their work, as well as work that the State Department can do, some of their use of diplomacy and some of their ability to speak to issues that we don't directly work on. But then I think also it is really important to ensure that there is that commitment to pursuing core democratic governance, rule of law work. You know, you can't substitute accountability principles within other sectors for it. You really need both, and they drive each other in a virtuous cycle.
I'll express an opinion too. For me, there are two issues here. One is that, as you said, and as I know you know, the governance is some dimension of everything. And being more cognizant of the governance dimensions of things, I think, is just good development. And we should have been doing it all along, and we weren't always doing it. And so the more we can become attentive or even obliged to be more attentive to those things, I think the better. But at a different level, to try and push a global governance or a national governance issue, We need to get much clearer about what we're pushing. And one of the things that, there are many things I think were wrong about the MDGs, but one thing that was very good is that they were very concrete and they had metrics on this. And good governance suffers from not having that. And because it's so many different things to so many people and genuinely is all of those things, we lose the ability to get any real momentum behind any one of those things. And so I really thought it was a plus when the high-level panel identified some specifics and some metrics, even though they didn't pick all the ones I would have liked. And to have some things of that sort that really become not simply the West dictating to the global South on this, but go through a process where those things have really been signed on to, and therefore people have made a kind of a reciprocal commitment on this, I think it'd be a real step forward.
Yeah, my name is Phil Thomas. I work for George Mason University, and I work on global food security issues. And when you look at country-owned is one of the big issues with Feed the Future initiative. And you know, the reach there was work through the NGOs and the governments, develop a coalition to work together. Yet we all know there are problems in that issue. So who does that analysis? Who determines whether this pillar of Feed the Future worked? Is it the Bureau of Food Security? Is it another group in aid? How does that work together? Because quite frankly, what we're seeing is that it hasn't worked that well. It's more rhetoric than reality.
Let's take two or three. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Leon Morse with IREX. And David, you made a good point when you were talking about doing systems analysis, and one of the first things you have to do is ask who. But it seems that a lot of times when you ask that question, one of the answers is going to be elites of some stripe. And so my question is, where in the decision tree about working with these elite-controlled institutions and systems does an analysis of the incentives that you have to leverage come in? In other words, how can you make sure that when you're giving resources or programmatic authority to these elites, that they are in fact going to be advocating on behalf of the voiceless?
Thanks. Yes, sir.
I'm Michael Cooper with the Plowshare Group. Generally, when we talk about good governance, we're talking about good national government. But some of our peers here have reminded us that we're also talking about governance at the city level, at the ministerial level, even at the project level. I just wanted to take a step back for a moment to think about good governance at the global level. There are so many issues that cry out for better global governance that directly affect the development agenda. You know, three quick ones. Climate change is an obvious one. Migration and development is something around which we've seen increased dialogue with a global forum on migration and development, the high-level dialogue on migration and development. But you know, member states are starting to realize that to manage the benefits and burdens of migration, we need to step forward. And I think maybe just a third example that comes to my mind is capital flows, the sort of over-liberalization of capital flows. In many cases, we can point to it's really hurt the development agenda. So I understand that that's a separate conversation, but my question is, why is that a separate conversation?
One more.
My name is Jeff Swedberg. I work for the QED group, and I'd want to follow up a little bit on the monitoring and evaluation side. What Larry Cooley was saying about metrics I found really interesting. Governance does have some very high-level metrics, Transparency International, Freedom House, World Bank, and so forth, but it doesn't even come close to being able to come up with measures of attribution. And with the comments about Millennium Development Goals and some proposed metrics, I'm curious to hear how these might actually work towards developing indicators of attribution for actual programs on the ground.
Why don't I invite people to take any pieces of those they'd like. David, go ahead.
Sure. Going back to the first one, the question of who does the analysis in terms of kind of country ownership now that's working, and I think it touches on the second one as well, the question of kind of elites and looking at their incentives. You know, I think Andrew can speak to it perhaps a little bit more because DFID has more experience, but we're hoping to take kind of political economy analysis approach as a way of thinking and initially have that done perhaps by, you know, we have some fellows, we're crafting a new PEA tool. We just had 75 USAID officers earlier this week on a webinar to roll out the first kind of effort at that being tailored to country, sector, and problem levels. So really trying to get at this question of, at a problem level, how would you operationalize it? How do you understand political economy as it relates to the challenge you're trying to overcome? But I would like to imagine that over the medium to longer term, that wouldn't be something that is a specialized expertise of DRG officers, but is something that would kind of become broadly understood as an aspect of engagement. And I also would like to suggest that some of the principles in the systems framework about inclusive stakeholder consultation and things like that offer the opportunity to bring some of those perspectives in and to gain some insight into those questions without it being a formalized thing. So I don't think you can only understand kind of how realistic is it that these groups are going to work together, or that the government is going to accept civil society in real partnership just from doing some sort of formal analytical tool. You can also get that from really good ongoing conversation and dialogue. If the situation is not ideal, then I think you start looking for best fit solutions, you start looking for second best solutions, and building coalitions that can do something given the constraints you face. And I think that moving to accept that and being more upfront that might be what an analysis points us to, and therefore that's what we're going to do, is part of what I'm hoping will become a more common practice, perhaps through this broadening the understanding of the risks we face and how that informs the choices we make.
Andrew?
Great. Can I just, I'd like to pick up on the plowshare point about why there's a separate conversation on sort of the global governance pieces. I mean, I think we all agree that we need to move from a kind of an aid perspective to a broader development perspective, and so we intellectually buy the importance of these issues. And I think, if I can blow the UK government's trumpet, we have to some degree. I mean, our work under the G8 on tax transparency, I think, is really positive. I work on extractives transparency as well, and I think that also, it's quite interesting how that plays into some of the elite conversations in country, because if you look at some of the drivers on elites and their actions in country, there are often global factors at play there. And I'm positive on the climate change side, that I think the post-2015 debate is actually starting to bring these agendas together, and especially the financing track, I think, will be an interesting one where we could make progress. Migration, I'm not very optimistic on. There's too much domestic politics at play. Maybe if I can just touch on the points that David covered, I thought so well, in terms of elites and ensuring work for the voiceless. I mean, I agree entirely. I think you need that PEA analysis, and you need it at multiple levels, from the sort of country and even international level down to a local level, and you need it. The challenge, I think we've talked about many of the challenges already, of actually operationalizing it into your activity. I think that's the harder ask. But this is where I think also the systems thinking is really important, in trying to think through the different, how the different actors play, and the fact that elites are shaped by multiple pressures and influences on them, and you need to understand those multiple pressures.
I would just add one thing about, I mean, I agree with what's been said about leverage and incentives, and I just have one thing. I think we sometimes forget that we do have significant leverage to induce change or incentives. I mean, we are, in a lot of instances, we put a lot of money into these countries through our foreign aid program, and I mean, I think people often will say, oh, well, but there's someone else who could replace us, whether that's the Chinese or the Brazilians or the Indians or some other emerging new donor. But what people often forget is that most of the foreign aid that we give is not the same kind of foreign aid that those countries are giving. China it's mostly infrastructure development. They're not going to do the large-scale public health programs that we're doing, which are extremely important to most of these countries. And they're not going to do the agricultural development programs, except maybe at a very small scale, and that's mostly South-South technical aid cooperation. So I think we need to always keep in mind that when we do this political economic analysis, and we have a better understanding of what these elite structures are, and we're trying to get a reform, we do have some leverage to induce some of that. It's not going to work perfectly, and I'm certainly not saying we should cut off funding immediately for PEPFAR in one of these countries if they're not going to do it, but that leverage does exist, and I think we always do need to keep that in mind.
I'd add that I think the issue that a couple of you pointed to about who's doing the analysis, who's making the decision, what's country ownership, who's the country. Those are really the right questions. And going to this local systems approach doesn't solve that. It actually complicates it, but in a good way, in the sense that it takes some of the decision-making out of the hands of a donor agency and tries to put it back into figuring out what the heck the local system is. And that goes all the way back to me, in my mind, to who does the analysis. I mean, this notion that somehow you fly in, you do a political economy, and I've done a number of those things. I can tell you, if you don't know that country deeply, it's really hard to do something that's not entirely superficial. When you do that, plus, it gets really, really close to being intrusive in somebody else's affairs to do that. So trying to figure out where the line is in terms of who's doing this kind of analysis and for whose benefit and to what use, I think is the cutting edge of this set of issues. I don't think we should shy away from it. I think we're right to be in the middle of it, but I think we'd be wrong to not recognize how nuanced and complicated it is. The other thing I would say on the issue of metrics, I think in this area, we're disadvantaged by being so inclusive about what we incorporate into the concept of governance. As I said before, I don't think we're wrong to include that. I just think it's unhelpful to include it, because when you lump more and more things into it, it gets more and more difficult. I once had the job with colleagues at MSI of trying to do a handbook of indicators for democracy and governance. And I'm telling you, that thing went on for page after page after page after page. Not because you couldn't find an indicator, but because there were so many things you were trying to measure, even within rule of law. Rule of law is an abstraction. What do you mean by rule of law? As soon as people can tell you what they really mean by it, you can figure out a way to measure it. But until they can, then the measurement system is really the victim of the lack of clarity about the objectives that we're trying to put forward. And I think we've sort of cheated by going to this issue of governance. I'm not sorry, because I think it's an important issue, but we cheated because we threw so many things together without being very clear about what they were, and we're reaping the consequences of that in our measurement problems. That's why I think if we're going to be serious with the MDGs on this, even if you don't like the ones they pick, it needs to be linked to some concrete deliverables, some metrics, and the countries around the globe need to sign on to those as being of interest to them, and therefore not an intrusive measure, but rather one they would welcome, like child survival. Yes, sir.
Yeah, my name is Rick O'Sullivan. I'm from Change Management Solutions, and I'm not just the co-chair of the Civil Society Work Group, but I founded it. So you can imagine at lunch today when one of the keynote speakers said anything that's not government is private sector, I died a little inside. So this morning, just now, I'm curious, when I saw the work that David presented, I was very optimistic because it seems to decouple governance from government and open opportunities for non-governmental direct management by civil society. As let me throw this in, de Tocqueville said, when you at any social objective in France, you find the government. In Britain, you find the aristocracy. In America, you find civil society as in governance. So, Connor, I was wondering if you could, when you were talking about what I heard was the primacy of government, working with government, how do you reconcile that with the notion that we should be rebalancing and shifting responsibilities out of the government into civil society to make them more transparent and more democratic?
I got the 5-finger sign from Tom, so Bob, and we'll take the 3 and go quickly.
Just a quick comment from the depth of my ignorance of this topic, and that is that I think the market may be eroding. There are countries that aren't interested in having work on governance, and unfortunately there are a number of countries that are getting too wealthy for an aid relationship. And I wonder whether we oughtn't to think of more indirect ways of helping on this issue rather than direct ways. International benchmarking, seminars where people, international seminars where people can hear peer cases, capacity building of institutions, both global and national, without a specific specific agenda in store, but just say this is the way you look at governance issues and so forth, without trying to be prescriptive, unless you have to because of certain aid programs. And I'd be interested in your reactions.
Yep. Yes, ma'am.
So Ritu Nair-Stone with NORC at the University of Chicago. I wanted to link two elements that were mentioned today, which is donor conditionalities, and I think Andrew mentioned payment by results, and the governance goal, which Larry mentioned has got 5 metrics. 2 of the metrics you mentioned was right to information and anti-corruption. Right. And so my question is, when you think of the practicalities of donors engaging with a country that's not willing to talk about, for example, 2 of the metrics at all. I was in Egypt when Hosni Mubarak was ousted, and I know there were a ton of donors that came into town, tried to talk and engage with the government, and the government was not willing to engage on human rights and anti-corruption. And then they turned to Saudi Arabia and got a lot of funding from them. So when you think of the governance goal being put into place and countries not willing to talk at all about some of the metrics, and donors still engaging with them, what kind of signal would that give, and how do you move forward from there?
Thanks. Let me go this way. Why don't you start, David? Go ahead.
Okay. Well, I'll mostly leave to Connor since it was directed to him, the first question. But just to say that I do think that there is a comfortable split between the primacy of government in stewarding and regulating people's lives and the vital role of civil society, and it's one of the things I think USAID is proud of, to the extent that we contributed to the expanding of the definition from Paris to Busan to be a more whole of society approach. And I think that's part of how I would answer the last question, in terms of where you have a government that really doesn't want you to come in and work on certain human rights issues. You know, part of it is that I think we have a proud track record as an agency in supporting people who are standing up for human rights in all sorts of circumstances. And I would expect that to continue, and I think that that's fully consistent with a locally owned approach, as long as what we mean by local ownership is kind of whole of society. We have a number of different objectives in development. These things sometimes work to an extent at cross purposes, and I think you know, I wouldn't want governance any more than any other single issue to be dictating, you know, conditionality in the sense of we will work with you only if this, and we won't work with you that. Those will always be nuanced decisions where we're pursuing a variety of aspects of development results and our own national interests simultaneously, and need to try and balance those things out. So I think we can be cognizant of signals being sent and try and do something about that and manage that, but I don't think that there's a singular solution to resolving that dilemma. So let me stop there. Andrew?
Maybe I think the point I want to make in concluding, I mean, I agree entirely. We need a holistic approach to our engagement on governance issues in country. But I do believe that if you want to deal with tricky development issues, you need, in the longer term, you need the role of government to provide you that sort of collective action. So I think governments are fundamental to the delivery of development outcomes. And I want to flag as well that I think where possible and where you judge it possible, and I think that's the key thing, is to judge the level of government commitment and not to engage where you judge that commitment is absent. Where possible, you need to use their systems. And what I mean by using their systems is the process of actually channeling support through government forces you to think about, are those systems weak? How can we strengthen them? In what ways do we need to add safeguards in the short term? So it's not just about use of government systems. The very process of using them strengthens them because it forces you to give attention to those issues.
Yeah, I actually, Andrew said it very well. I think you do need some level of government to provide public goods. I don't want you to think that I don't view civil society as an important instrument to hold governments accountable. I think we should do as much as we can to engage with civil society in order to strengthen them, and so that there is that sort of outside pressure group. I work at a think tank. I am a member of civil society in the United States, and so I see the importance of it. But you know, I think it's important to remember that even when de Tocqueville was here and made that comment, there was a level of government that existed in the United States that many of these countries still don't really even have. And our own governance issue at the time was about the balance between state government, local government versus the national government. But there was still something there, and I think from my perspective, we need to focus on both. And I do believe that, as Andrew said, we need to get the government to a level where they can provide basic goods that right now, in many cases, they're not providing.
I'll just make a couple of remarks. I think, Rick, in your question is really about civil society also as a delivery mechanism, right? Not in addition to an accountability mechanism. And don't answer back. In this environment, we're talking about multiple institutions trying to do lots of things. And one of the difficulties of trying to take a systems approach to this is it doesn't simplify that. It complicates it. And it does obviously bring in a role for civil society in this, but what it's going to be in any given case is very case specific and therefore not easy to prescribe from sitting up here. The thing I would say, though, is that if in those countries where we're working with a government that's adamantly opposed to some of the reforms that we're talking about, at some point you've got to worry about the moral hazard of continuing to do that. You're sending not only messages to them, you're sending messages to everybody else. I understand there are multiple objectives we have as a country, but it's hard not to see that as undermining some of them. That doesn't mean, though, that we have to be so ham-handed about this. You can't, I'm convinced after years of trying to do this, you cannot push a government to do something it's disinclined to do. You can help it do something that it wants to do, and you can sometimes be subtle about working around where the soft spots are in engendering support for change. But the notion that we would somehow come in with a mandate for what that government needs to do and think that the leverage we have by virtue of the dollars we bring is going to be sufficient to turn the tail, I think is unrealistic. Unless there's something really big, like wanting to EU accession, the leverage is going to be limited by the orders of magnitude of the size of their budgets relative to the size of ours, and I think we just need to look at realistically at what we can and can't do in those settings and what message we're sending by what we do. I'm ending this conversation very reluctantly because I really know that we've just scratched the surface of a large number of really interesting issues, and I want to thank you for contributing to that, and especially want to thank the panel.